There is a crisis that almost no one is watching. It has no bombs. It has no tanks. It has no images of fire leading every newscast. It does not have the kind of drama that usually takes over the public conversation. But it can hit something much closer to the daily lives of millions of people in the United States. Food. Because while Washington keeps fighting with Canada and keeps using tariffs as if everything were just a simple political pressure game, there is a quiet problem getting more serious. And that problem begins with something almost no one mentions. Potash. It may sound boring. It may sound technical. It may sound like a word buried in an agricultural report that nobody wants to read. But it is not. Potash is behind a large part of the food produced in the United States. It is in corn. It is in soybeans. It is in wheat. It is in many crops that fill huge fields and then end up in factories, markets, and supermarkets. It is not a small detail. It is not a secondary product. It is not something you can remove without consequences. It is a basic part of the system. And that is the first thing to understand. This story looks small only because it begins with a product most people never think about. But when a country depends on something basic to plant, produce, and sustain its agricultural system, that product stops being technical, becomes important, it becomes strategic, and it becomes dangerous when it enters a zone of tension. That is exactly what is happening here. The United States needs potash. It needs it in large quantities. It needs it every season. It needs it before planting. And it keeps needing it even when there are political fights, threats, tariffs, and tough speeches. That is the problem. Because one thing is to fight with another country over cars, steel, lumber, or products that can move between different markets. But it is something very different to strain relations with the country that controls a critical part of the fertilizer you need to produce food. That is where the story changes. Because now it is no longer only about trade. It is no longer only about politics. It is no longer only about who looks tougher at a press conference. It is about need, and that need does not disappear because someone in Washington wants to look tough. It does not disappear because tariffs are announced. It does not disappear because more domestic production is promised. It does not disappear because a president says everything will be solved through pressure. The need is still there, and as long as that need is still there, the pressure does not stay on the other side. It starts coming back. That is the change many people still are not seeing. The United States is not entering a comfortable fight. It is entering a fight while still depending on Canadian supply for a key part of its agriculture. And when that happens, the risk rises fast. Because if potash gets more expensive, the first blow does not land in Ottawa. It lands on farmers. It lands on the people who have to buy fertilizer before putting a single seed in the ground. It lands on producers who are already working with tight margins. It lands on people who cannot simply sit and wait for politics to calm down. That is not how farming works. Planting has a date. Fertilizer purchases have a date. Costs are locked in before the harvest. Decisions cannot be paused just because two governments are playing a pressure game. And that is why this story is much more serious than it looks. Because it does not begin with a big explosion. It begins quietly. It begins with a more expensive purchase. It begins with an uncomfortable call between supplier and producer. It begins with a cost calculation that leaves less margin than last year. It begins with the feeling that something basic is starting to feel less secure. And when an agricultural system starts to feel that, the problem does not stay still. It moves from fertilizer to the field, from the field to production costs, from production costs to the final price of food. That is how it moves. That is the real heart of this story. It is not only that Canada sells potash, it is that the United States needs it. It is not only a fight between governments, it is a relationship in which one side controls a part of the supply, the other side cannot easily afford to lose. And that is where the most uncomfortable part of all appears. Because if Washington keeps pushing, without having a quick way out, the country may end up discovering something it did not want to admit clearly, that in a key part of its agricultural system it does not have the control it thought it had. That is the real beginning of this crisis. Not a crisis of loud headlines. Not a crisis that explodes in a single day. Not a crisis that is first felt in politics, but a slower crisis, a quieter crisis, a deeper crisis, and precisely because of that, a more dangerous one. Because when a problem is slow, many people ignore it at first. When a problem is technical, many people think it will not touch them. When a problem begins with a fertilizer, almost nobody imagines it could end up in the pockets of millions of families. But that is how many real crises begin. They do not begin with an explosion. They begin with a dependency that was always there, but suddenly becomes visible. And that is what is happening now. The dependency always existed. It is just being exposed now. And when a dependency like that is exposed in the middle of a trade fight, the story stops being about political pride. It becomes a weakness that affects farmers, a weakness that can push costs higher, a weakness that can end up making food production more expensive in one of the biggest agricultural countries in the world. That is why this is not a small issue, because once a basic input enters a zone of tension, everything else starts moving behind it. Producer profitability moves, the cost of planting moves, pressure on the harvest moves, and sooner or later, the price people pay moves too. That is why this story matters so much. Not because the word potash sounds big, not because there is yet another fight between the United States and Canada, not because Washington wants to sound tough, but because a key part of the American agricultural system depends on something Canada already controls. And when a trade fight starts touching something that basic, the problem stops being far away. It starts getting closer. First to the field, then to the market, and then to everyone's table. The big question is not only what Mark Carney said, the big question is why he chose to say it now. And the answer matters a lot, because that line did not come at just any moment. It did not come when his government was weak. It did not come while he was fighting just to survive politically. It came right after Carney achieved something important, a real parliamentary majority. That changes everything, because one thing is to talk about economic independence when you govern in fear of falling on any vote. And it is something very different to do it when you have just gained room, control, and time. Now Carney is not speaking like a temporary leader. He is speaking like a prime minister who feels he finally has the space to start changing the country's direction. And that is exactly what makes this story bigger than it seems. Because when Carney says that the relationship with the United States has become a weakness, he is not just throwing out a tough line to sound strong for one day. He is preparing Canada for a new way of thinking about its economy, its trade, and its security. And here is the important part. Carney is not reacting to just one bad week. He is reacting to a buildup of pressure. First came the tariffs. Then came the uncertainty. Then came increasingly aggressive language from Washington. And then came something even more delicate, the feeling that Canada can no longer treat the United States as an automatic and predictable partner. That is the real background of this story. This is not only Carney versus Trump. It is Canada revisiting an idea that had been almost untouchable for decades. The idea that its closeness to the United States was, by itself, enough protection. Carney is saying that it is not anymore, and saying that out loud changes a lot. Because once a prime minister admits that dependence on Washington no longer protects, but instead exposes, then the next step is no longer just talking. The next step is acting, and that is why this line comes now. It comes when Carney has more power. It comes when tension with Washington no longer looks temporary. And it comes when his government needs to build a new story for Canada. A story where the country depends less on what happens south of the border. A story where Ottawa has more room to move. A story where the message is no longer, let's wait for Washington to calm down, but we need to prepare for a world in which Washington is no longer the same. That is what makes this moment so serious, because we are no longer watching just a political response. We are watching the beginning of a new way of thinking about the country. And when the way a country thinks changes, everything else changes after it. Trade changes, investment changes, energy changes, infrastructure changes, and the way it negotiates with the most powerful neighbor on the continent changes too. That is the real weight of this chapter. Carney spoke now because now he can. Because now he has a majority. Because now he has room. Because now the pressure from Washington has given him the argument he needed. And because now he can start selling Canada an idea that not long ago would have sounded too radical. That the country's biggest economic relationship may also be its biggest point of weakness. This is where the story becomes more serious. Because when people hear a title like this, they may imagine something sudden, a total break, a closed border, a collapse in trade, a clean split between Canada and the United States. That is not what is happening. What is beginning is slower than that. But in some ways, it is much bigger. Because this is not really about Canada walking away from the United States overnight. It is about Canada starting to think differently about the relationship that has shaped its economy for decades, and that change in mindset can matter more than one tariff, one speech, or one angry headline. Mark Carney is not saying that the United States no longer matters. He cannot say that. No Canadian Prime Minister could say that and still sound serious. The U.S. is still too big, too close, too tied to Canada's economy. Trade, investment, energy, manufacturing, and supply chains are still deeply connected, so this is not a story about Canada cutting the cord in one move. It is a story about Canada deciding that the old way of depending on Washington is no longer safe enough. That is the real shift. For years, the basic idea was simple. The relationship could be messy sometimes. There could be disputes. There could be friction. There could be pressure on trade. But underneath all of that, the United States was still seen as the fixed center of Canada's economic world, still the safe market, still the stable partner, still the place Canada could afford to lean on the most. Carney is now saying that this way of thinking has become dangerous. Reuters reported that in his video address, he said Canada's close ties to the U.S., once seen as a strength, have become a weakness that must be corrected, and that Canada can no longer rely on American stability or goodwill in the same way. That changes the conversation completely, because once a prime minister says that out loud, he is no longer just criticizing Washington. He is rewriting Canada's priorities. He is telling the country that the old model is no longer enough. He is telling businesses that the old assumptions are no longer safe, and he is telling voters that this is not just about waiting for the United States to calm down and return to normal. That last part matters a lot, because one of the biggest ideas behind Carney's message is that normal may not be coming back. AP reported that Carney described today's world as more divided and more unstable, and argued that relying too heavily on one foreign partner is no longer a safe strategy for Canada. That means this is not a short-term answer to Trump alone. It is the beginning of a longer strategy, a strategy built around one clear idea. Canada must become less exposed to Washington's tariffs, less exposed to Washington's political swings, less exposed to the kind of pressure that can hit when too much of your system depends on one market. And once you understand that, the phrase break with Washington starts to make more sense, because the break is not mostly physical. It is strategic. It is mental. It is political. It is Canada beginning to say, we will still deal with the United States, but we are no longer going to build our future as if the U.S. is always stable, always reliable, and always safe to depend on. That is a huge change, and it becomes even more important because Carney is not saying this from a weak position. Reuters reported just days earlier that he secured a parliamentary majority, giving him much more room to govern, legislate, and push long-term policy through 2029. That means this is not just rhetoric. This can turn into policy, and once it does, the effects will spread. They will spread into trade, they will spread into energy, they will spread into internal infrastructure, they will spread into investment decisions, they will spread into where Canada looks for growth next. AP reported that Carney paired his warning with a broader plan, attract more foreign investment, diversify trade, expand clean energy, reduce internal trade barriers between provinces, raise affordability measures, and increase defense spending. That tells us something very important. He is not just describing a problem. He is trying to build a national response to it. That is where this chapter gets more interesting, because now we are no longer talking only about what Canada wants to avoid. We are also talking about what Canada wants to become. Carney is trying to move the country from a model of dependence to a model of resilience, from hoping Washington behaves predictably to preparing for a world where it may not, from assuming the U.S. relationship is enough to building an economy that has more than one pillar holding it up. That is not dramatic in the Hollywood sense, but politically, it is a very big move, because countries do not change direction only when trade falls apart. Sometimes they change direction when trust falls apart first, and that may be what we are seeing here. Not the end of trade, not the end of cooperation, not a sudden collapse of North America, but the beginning of something colder. Canada that still trades heavily with the U.S., but no longer wants to bet everything on it. A Canada that still works with Washington, but does not want Washington to define its limits. A Canada that is no longer treating proximity as protection. That is why this chapter matters so much, because this is the moment where the story stops being about one speech and becomes about a new national posture, a posture built on caution, on diversification, on internal strength, and on the belief that too much dependence on one powerful neighbor is no longer a sign of safety. It is a risk, and once a country begins to see its biggest relationship that way, the break has already started, not as a clean split, but as a change in direction that may be much harder to reverse than many people realize. This is where the story stops being about one speech, because the real question now is not whether Mark Carney sounded tough, The real question is what happens if he actually means to, and all signs suggest that he does. Reuters reported that Carney did not just complain about Washington. He said Canada must take more control over its own future, because the old relationship with the United States is no longer safe enough to depend on in the same way. AP reported the same basic message: reduce dependence, diversify trade, attract more investment, build more at home, and prepare for a world where U.S. policy is more unpredictable and more aggressive. That matters because once a country starts thinking that way, the effects do not stay in words. They start moving into policy. They move into trade deals. They move into energy strategy. They move into infrastructure. They move into defense spending. They move into where money is invested and where supply chains are built. And that is where this gets very real, because Canada cannot fully break from the United States overnight. That is not realistic. The U.S. is still too big, too close, and too deeply tied to Canada's economy. But a country does not need a total break for the relationship to change. It only needs a new direction, and that may be exactly what we are watching now. Reuters reported that Carney now governs with a 174-seat majority in the House of Commons, which means he has far more room to push long-term changes without relying on opposition votes. That gives him something he did not have before: the ability to turn a warning into a program. That is the key difference. Before, a line like this could have sounded like frustration. Now it sounds like preparation. Preparation for a Canada that trades more broadly. Preparation for a Canada that tries to depend less on one market. Preparation for a Canada that treats American pressure not as a temporary problem, but as a reason to rebuild the country's economic strategy. And that is where Washington may have a bigger problem than it realizes. Because if Trump's pressure convinced Ottawa that dependence itself is the danger, then the damage goes beyond tariffs. It changes trust. And once trust changes, everything else starts changing after. Businesses become more cautious. Governments become more defensive. New infrastructure becomes easier to justify. New foreign partners become more attractive. And old assumptions stop feeling safe. That is why this story is bigger than one speech. It may be the beginning of a colder relationship, not a complete break, not a clean divorce, but a colder, harder more cautious relationship where Canada still works with the United States, but no longer wants to build its future around the belief that Washington will always act in a stable way. That is a major shift. And Carney seems to understand that this has to be sold not just as a foreign policy issue, but as a national one. AP reported that he paired his warning with a broader economic message. More investment, cleaner energy, fewer internal trade barriers, more resilience, and a stronger domestic base. That tells us he is not just trying to answer Trump. He is trying to redefine what strength means for Canada. That may be the most important part of all. Because for years, strength meant access to the U.S. Now Carney is trying to argue that strength means surviving, even when that access becomes risky. That is a very different model. And if Canadians accept it, then this moment will matter far beyond this week's headlines, because then the break has already begun, not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet change in how Canada sees its place in North America, a change from dependence to caution, a change from trust to calculation, change from assuming stability to preparing for instability. And once a country makes that change in its head, it rarely goes all the way back. That is why this matters, not because Canada is suddenly gone, not because Washington no longer matters, not because trade is about to collapse tomorrow, but because something more lasting may now be in motion. Canada is beginning to think like a country that no longer believes its closest relationship is automatically its safest one. And if that thinking turns into policy, then this will not be remembered as just another clash with Trump. It will be remembered as the moment Canada started preparing for a future where depending on Washington felt more dangerous than depending on itself.